In this video, I will be describing Jupyter Notebook and its basic interface. Jupyter Notebook is an open source web application that allows us to create content using HTML, Markdown, and even LaTeX, and then combine all that with special code cells, all within a single document that is called a notebook. Now, these special code cells don't just display code. They're actually connected to a live kernel, which allows users to enter, modify, and execute code on the fly and all within the same document. Any output, graphical or otherwise, is also immediately available within the document. So right now, I'm assuming that you've already followed the installation instructions and can start the Jupyter Notebook server. However, just to remind you, in a terminal to start Jupyter Notebook, you can simply type Jupyter Notebook, hit enter, and you'll see some output similar to this. This should automatically open up Jupyter Notebook in your web browser. If for some reason it does not, you can always copy and paste one of these links here at the bottom into your web browser. For those of you using Anaconda, you can click the launch button for either Jupyter Lab or Jupyter Notebook. If I switch over to a Windows machine here, you can see both Jupyter Lab and Jupyter Notebook are available. And so we simply click launch, and this is going to start the server, and then it's going to open up a browser for us. Now, as a side note, for those of you using the terminal to start Jupyter Notebook, you can actually use Jupyter Lab as well. And to do that, just replace notebook here with lab, it's L-A-B. And actually, at the end of this video, I'll give you a quick demonstration of Jupyter Lab as well. Okay, so let's start with help. Now, the help menu in Jupyter Notebook has a user interface tour. Now, if you select this, it's going to present you with a series of tooltips that point out and describe the basic elements of the interface. Now, I'm not going to do this here, but I do recommend that you check it out. Also in here is the list of current keyboard shortcuts. Now, there are many of these, and learning a few can actually go a very long way. You can also customize the shortcuts if you happen not to like these ones. If you go to Help and select Edit Keyboard Shortcuts, this will allow you to modify the shortcuts to something that's more convenient for you. The next two links in the Help menu take you to the official Jupyter Notebook help pages, as well as a description of the Markdown language that is used in the Markdown cells or text cells within the notebook itself. Now, you may have noticed that a Jupyter Notebook is broken up into a series of cells, and each of these cells has a type. And we're only going to talk about the two main types, namely text or Markdown cells and code cells. Now, in the Jupyter Notebook and Jupyter Lab world, text cells are referred to as Markdown cells, and in the Google Colab world, the same cells are referred to as text cells. So I'm going to attempt to use Markdown here. Just know if you see them referred to as text or Markdown in different interfaces, they're really referring to the same thing. As I mentioned earlier, we can use a number of markup languages to create the content for a Markdown cell. And we can actually mix them within a cell. So for instance, this cell is using Markdown for the header and for the hyperlinks, but then is also using LaTeX to render this equation at the bottom. If we scroll back up, the title for this document is actually rendered using HTML. So in here we have a div tag and an image tag, as well as the actual image embedded inside the cell. And of course, you can use any of the markup languages you wish within a Markdown cell to create your specific content. The other type of cell we're going to discuss is a code cell. A code cell can contain actual code and is connected to a live kernel running in the background. The code cells can be executed, which means that the code in the cell is passed to and then evaluated by a kernel. Any output from the code is returned and displayed underneath the editable area of the cell. Now, in this simple example here, we're simply allowing the interpreter or kernel to output the value of the last statement in the code cell as text. However, the output displayed here could be anything. Say if you're plotting data, then this could be a figure or even an animation. Cells also have two modes: edit mode, in which you can modify the cell's contents, and command mode, which is effectively the rendered or uneditable version of the cell. With code cells, it's difficult and perhaps irrelevant to try to discern between the two modes, since simply clicking anywhere in a code cell allows you to edit the code immediately, and then the output of the cell appears below the editable area. However, with Markdown cells, the two modes are a bit easier to see and perhaps more interesting. Currently, the Markdown cell here is in command mode. That is, the underlying markup has been processed and the final result is rendered within the cell. If I double click the cell, or if you press enter on the selected cell, Then the cell is going to switch over to edit mode. And now we can make changes to the markup that was used to create the cell's content. To exit edit mode, we have to run the cell. Now this means we either execute the code if it's a code cell, or we process the markup if it's a markdown cell. There are several ways to run a cell. And actually in this cell, I've given you a few of those ways in the bulleted list towards the bottom. And the first one states we can use the run button on the top toolbar. So if we go to the toolbar here and hover over the run button for just a moment, you'll see that a tooltip pops up and tells us that this button will run the cell and then select the next cell in a notebook. This means actually that you could click this button several times to run cells one after another, kind of working your way through the notebook. Now, if the cell you're running is a code cell, and maybe it's taking too long to complete, or you realize something has gone wrong and you want to stop the execution of that cell, you can interrupt the kernel and stop the cell's execution using the stop button here. The next button will restart the kernel. Restarting the kernel means that we remove the state of any variables that have been created or any data that's been loaded. This button will stop the current kernel's execution and start a brand new one for you. In fact, if you click this button, a warning will pop up and verify that you actually want this to happen. And similarly, the next button with the two triangles, or the fast forward button here, does the same thing, except that after the kernel has been restarted, it will attempt to run every cell in the notebook from top to bottom. Moving back to the first button on the toolbar, this is the save button, which obviously saves the current state of the notebook, including any output in the cells. Now, I should point out that the notebook will periodically checkpoint itself or save itself, but as with everything, you should really be in the habit of saving your work as often as possible. The next series of buttons deal with the creation, removal, and positioning of cells. So the first button here inserts a cell below the currently selected cell. So if I click this button, you'll see that we got a brand new cell directly below the previously selected cell. By default, new cells are of type code, right? And we see that here in this drop-down box on the toolbar. We can modify the cell type by clicking on the drop-down box and selecting from one of the options. For instance, I can make this new cell a markdown cell. The next three buttons deal with the cut, copy, and pasting of cells. So I currently have a cell selected. If I select cut, it's removed from the notebook, and I can move my cursor, say, to this code block and click the paste button, which will paste it immediately below the previously selected cell. If I were to say select the code cell again and say copy and then paste, again, it pastes it immediately below the currently selected cell. And if I wish to rearrange the order of cells, I can use the next two buttons in the toolbar, which have the up and down arrows. So with this code cell selected, I'm going to hit the up arrow to move this up within the notebook. And then I can, of course, move it down if I wish to. Now, all of the items in the toolbar can also be found in the menu items on the menu bar. Now, I'm not going to go through all the menu items here. Instead, I'm going to leave you to explore this on your own. I will say that the toolbar does contain only a subset of what is available to you. And at the very end of this notebook, there is a short description of each item on the toolbar, along with a small picture here pointing out where each of these items is. And with that, I'm going to wrap up the Jupyter Notebook portion of this video, and we're going to quickly switch over to Jupyter Lab just to show you what that interface looks like, even though we're not going to be going through it in any real detail. Jupyter Lab is an application that actually sits on top of Jupyter Notebook, and it allows us to manipulate multiple notebooks at one time. So you'll notice on the right-hand side here, we have a tabbed interface. Each of these tabs could have a different notebook open that you are actively editing or working with. The toolbar on the top is actually quite similar to what we have in Jupyter Notebook. And on the left-hand side, we have a couple of panes that we can view. The first is a file browser, which allows us to traverse our local file system and load other notebooks. The second pane is the running terminals and kernels pane, which gives us a listing of any kernels and terminals that are currently running, as well as a list of all open tabs. And this pane here is the table of contents pane. This pane is actually automatically generated from the Jupyter Notebook itself. So it uses the headers that you write within the Markdown cells in order to create a table of contents here. You notice also that I can click on elements in this hierarchical view in order to jump to different sections of my notebook. And the last pane here is actually for Jupyter Lab extensions. I currently don't have any extensions installed, but if you find extensions you like, you can actually install and manage those extensions here. So with that, we'll wrap up this video, and we hope now that you have a better understanding of the interfaces for both Jupyter Lab and Jupyter Notebook.